Hello. The Yukon Crumbling Foundation research team presents a basic introduction to mechanisms that cause cracking and damage to concrete foundations due to the presence of the mineral pyrrhotite. This is a simplified overview for homeowners and the general public and does not capture all details which can be found in the scientific literature. Here we address the problem that has been observed in hundreds of homes across northeastern Connecticut. In these images, captured by the Yukon research team in 2016, it is possible to see the characteristic network of cracks that signals the presence of the mineral pyrrhotite. Similar images have been observed in structures around the world, including Canada, Spain, and Norway, in areas with similar geological features. Many homeowners are immediately alarmed when they observe crack in a foundation wall. It is important to note that not all concrete cracking is due to pyrrhotite. There are several different reasons that many foundations show some cracking over time, including poor construction, uneven settling of the underlying soil, shrinkage due to freezing and thawing in cold climates, and moisture leaks in basements. If you have cracks in your foundation and are located in an area where pyrrhotite may be a concern, differentiating between other types of cracks and the characteristic pyrrhotite cracking pattern can be done by a trained structural engineer or licensed home inspector. A list of certified inspectors in Connecticut by the Connecticut Foundation Indemnity Company can be found in this URL. Please note that the Yukon team does not conduct visual inspections, nor are we licensed to provide a formal classification of your foundation. To discuss how pyrrhotite damages concrete, let's first take a look at its basic composition. You may have poured concrete at your home yourself, but if not, there are three ingredients: aggregate, which is gravel, sand, or crushed stone; Portland cement that you buy off the shelf; and water. The mix of the three ingredients is initially a dense fluid that can be poured in different shapes, and which hardens over time to form concrete. By the time you move into a new home, the concrete in a foundation has cured for several months, and you typically see a hard and smooth surface in your basement. To understand the role of pyrrhotite, we first need to get an overview of the chemical element of sulfur, which is the key component that drives all reactions in the damaged concrete. You may recognize sulfur as the cause behind the rotten egg smell when it is present in gas form. Sulfur is a chameleon that has the capacity to transform to several different species with different names and behavior in the environment. The reason that it is so flexible is that it can both acquire electrons from other elements and become negative, and also lend electrons to other elements and become positive. The two forms of sulfur shown here that are relevant for concrete are sulfide and sulfate. Sulfide is negatively charged and likes environments that are poor in oxygen. When oxygen is present, sulfur enjoys binding with 4 oxygen atoms and share its electrons in a molecule called sulfate. Sulfide and sulfate can transform to each other depending on whether they are able to find a way to exchange electrons with other atoms, including oxygen. Sulfide and sulfate do not exist independently in nature. They bind with other elements to form crystals. Sulfide often binds with iron, and it can do so in different ways. Pyrrhotite and pyrite are both iron sulfide minerals, but they have different proportions of iron to sulfur and different ways to arrange the iron and sulfur atoms in their structure. This different arrangement causes them to have slightly different behavior in the environment. Example, the rate and how they react with oxygen. In northeastern Connecticut, the local geology seems to favor pyrrhotite alone. Most concrete that shows no damage is made with aggregate that has little or no sulfur. Ordinary Portland cement always has some sulfur in the form of gypsum or calcium sulfate. Since mixing water is also typically free of sulfur, normal concrete will have some sulfur in form of sulfate, which is derived from the Portland cement mixed into it. The sulfur concentration in concrete depends on the proportion of aggregate, cement and water used in the mix, and is typically in the range 0.08 to 0.28% by weight of concrete. That means that even clean standard concrete has a minimum level of sulfur as sulfate from Portland cement. When we consider concrete from crumbling foundations, there is an additional source of sulfur. Sulfide, in the form of pyrrhotite or pyrite, is present in the aggregate and adds to the total sulfur of concrete. The next step is to understand what pyrrhotite in concrete does and why. For that, we need to take a closer look at the concrete structure. If you actually take a piece of concrete and look at it under the microscope, you will discover that it is not a homogeneous material, like say a piece of steel. The pieces of aggregate that were used to mix it are still visible as particles of various sizes. As you can see here, the particles themselves may be porous and include several smaller types of particles. In between the particles, you can see the whitish matrix that is the hardened cement, and which is essentially the glue that keeps the concrete together. The matrix has small pores that allow water and air to be exchanged with the surrounding environment. Now we can build a model of what sulfide does in concrete. Oxygen from the atmosphere dissolves in the poured water, enters the particle pores, and reacts with the sulfide, to make sulfate. The sulfate then enters the cement matrix and makes another mineral called ettringite. Ettringite particles look like needles, as you see on the bottom right image here, and those needles push outwards, causing cracks in the matrix. These cracks become progressively larger as they allow more and more water and oxygen to enter, accelerating the reactions and ultimately the visible damage. There are several factors that influence how fast this whole process happens and how extensive the damage is. Of course, the amount of pyrrhotite is a key factor. In addition to that, the location and size of the mineral within the matrix and how exposed the surface is to external attack are important. The rate at which new oxygen enters the pore from outside will affect the rate of reaction with pyrrhotite, and ultimately also the rate of sulfate production and formation of the ettringite mineral that causes the expansion. We know that the amount of water present and how fast new water penetrates the concrete plays a role in the whole reaction chain, but we don't know exactly how. We also do not know how much ettringite has to form for expansion to occur and damage to become visible. The goal of the Yukon study, funded by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, is to carefully analyze each factor and use this knowledge to build a risk prediction model that takes all these conditions into account.